Thank you, Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished scholars. It's an honor to be here in the 11th South Asia Conference at IDSA. I would like to extend my gratitude to colleagues at IDSA for extending invitation. My topic is religious radicalization, the case of Taliban, and I would like to talk about how we understand the evolution of radicalization within the Taliban, and it's very important in the current phase, particularly as the peace talks are going on. Yesterday we had Abu Dhabi talks between the US and the Taliban, and ironically the current phase of peace process has intentionally somehow ignored or avoided to address the root causes of the problem, which is radicalization of the Taliban. And the fundamental baseline or justification which is given for the current phase of peace talks is that the point is that Taliban are no more radical threat to the US and region as it were in 90s. Also the fact it's pointed out that the Taliban could be tamed within a democratic political order as they would be accommodated within the same order, as this order has tamed many of the other Muslim mujahideen and which were reintegrated after 2001 in Afghanistan. To give you a broad picture of how serious this radicalization of Taliban is, I would like to quote some of the numbers and figures which are provided by the National Security Council of Afghanistan as well as from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the US. The report by CSIS indicates that the number of radical extremists in 2018 declined somewhat from the height which was in 2016, but it is still a near peak level since 1980. To put this in a historical perspective, the high estimate of fighters in 2018 is 270% greater than 2011. So this reflects a 180% increase in the number of fighters between 2001 and 2013. So the region with the largest number of radical extremist fighters is North Africa, West Asia, and South Asia. And now in case of Afghanistan, it is the second highest number of radical fighters after Syria, which consists between 27,000 to 68,000 people of radical fighters. Based on the National Security Council of Afghanistan, an estimated 60,000 fighters within 20 groups are fighting in Afghanistan. And the classification of National Security Council is they classified these 20 groups into 4 categories. The first category is the global jihadists who are fighting within the framework of either Al-Qaeda and its affiliates or Islamic State and its provinces. The estimation says that there are 500 Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and almost something around 4,000 IS people affiliated with the Khorasan province. The second category is the regional terrorist organizations. The regional terrorist organizations like ETIM or IOM, Jamaat Ansarullah or Jundullah, these are functioning in Afghanistan, but their aim is beyond the national boundaries in Afghanistan. They are mainly targeting China or Russia or Iran. So it's transnational linkages there. The third category is Pakistani groups. And you know many of these Pakistani groups who are functioning like Lashkar Taiba, Lashkar Islam or Jaish-e-Mohammed. And the number of fighters estimated in Afghanistan is 9,000. But the big elephant in the room is the Taliban with almost 45,000 of fighters against the army and the US troops. Now, in the last 40 years of the war in Afghanistan, there has been some sort of normalization of violence and radicalization. That's why there's a certain level of ambiguity when it comes to the understanding of radicalization. I'd like to highlight or flag 3 fundamental misleading perceptions when it comes to the radicalization of Taliban, and subsequently I will counter these 3 misleading propositions. The first misleading proposition about Taliban is that Taliban is a political group with a political agenda, and it's not as fanatic and radical as it is the case with Al-Qaeda or IS. Rather, it's claimed that they resemble some of the Islamic parties in the region, which their insurgency is based on certain level of legitimate grievances. Now, to decode this, what does it mean that Taliban is a political actor with political agenda? Let's say some of the claims of Taliban. When Taliban claim that they want to establish an Islamic state in the name of Emirat Islami, this contradictory literature assumes or interprets for us that this is not a theological state as Al-Qaeda wants to establish or IS wants to establish. The main goal of Taliban, according to this perspective, is it's not a war, a global jihad against the Western values. It's a kind of self-defense war for the freedom of the country against the occupation of the foreign forces. So this contradictory literature says that when the Taliban call for an Islamic state, it's not a theological state, rather it's an independent state that they... Second example is when it comes to the contradiction between, incompatibility between Taliban ideology and the modern values like election and democracy. Again, the justification which is given by some of the literature is that the Taliban reject elections and democracy, not because of the essence of election, but it's mainly based on some political reasoning. You will read the same kind of declarations which Taliban gave, that they say that they do not believe in the elections. It's because it's unfair, it has not been representative enough, and it has been biased. And lastly, if I give examples on the legitimate grievances that the literature has produced, there are three, at least you will see three grievances that has highlighted. The first one is the exclusion of Taliban from the Bonn conference in 2001. So a number of authors and analysts has come up with the idea that this was a fundamental lack or vacuna, that Taliban has not been represented in the Bonn conference. The second one, the second grievance is that Taliban has been treated unfairly by the US and the government of Afghanistan. For example, they have been targeted, they have been killed, their houses are bombed, or they are persecuted in Guantanamo or Bagram. And lastly, there is also a claim of marginalization of Pashtuns after 2001, which led itself to the intensifying grievances of the Taliban. This is the first misleading proposition with regard to Taliban. The second one is this, that unlike the most of the Islamist ideologues, the Taliban ideology is not inspired from the global jihadi groups. Rather, it's more aligned with the local Pashtun culture of rural Afghanistan. Now, what does it mean? It means that when Taliban emerged in the 90s, much of their discontent was somehow with the Hobbesian breakdown of morality and state, which happened in civil war in the 90s. So the Taliban came up to re-establish the order, and it was much more than order. So because they were rooted at state, for example, if you read Anand Gopal or some other literature which has written about the Taliban origin, they say that Taliban has been rooted in a somehow combination of Sufism and Deobandi branch of Islam in Pakistan. So that's why their main aim was re-establishing of virtue in Afghanistan. So that's why if they have done a number of practices like banning of the liberties or limitation of the women's education, these were all justified because the Taliban claimed that they were in a state of exception, as the same similar kind of other emergency measures that might be undertaken by the democratic state. The third misleading interpretation or proposition about the Taliban is that it is argued that Taliban has become more benign and softer since their early incarnation in the 90s. It has realized, because the Taliban has realized that their dogmatic and harsh policies has annihilated them, both from the society in Afghanistan and also the Western countries. To give you an example, for example, Wahid Mishra, who is an expert on Taliban, he quotes Maulavi Trabi, who was the Minister of Justice of Taliban. many years after the fall of Taliban in Pakistan, that Mullah Trabi was reflecting on how dogmatic and how stupid their policies were when it comes about moral policing and religious policing of the society. And the author claims that, okay, I was somehow amazed to see a Trabi who was so much dogmatic and not willing to accept criticism on their practices. Now he was reflecting back about the policies of Taliban and saying that, okay, those were wrong. Similarly, a number of analysts also claims that the Taliban has now realized that they cannot be alienated from the international community and particularly the US. That's why they realize their mistakes and they will not repeat it. So now I do not agree with these three propositions. We need to, it's important from my perspective to consider that Taliban has undergone a series of ideological transformation since their early inception. The evolution of Taliban explain the trend of radicalization in Afghanistan. Taliban has transformed from a traditional group which was mainly a mixture of local Sufism plus local Deobandism plus those are students of Hujras and Madrasas, and now they have adopted much more political Islam brands. For example, even you can see the shades of Muslim Brotherhood and even Salafi ideologies within Taliban. I can see this the trend of radicalization in three different manifestations or three different points. The first one is the urge of Taliban for establishment of Islamic State. If you just closely follow up what's the current phase of negotiation, repeatedly the number one claim of Taliban is that they are fighting for an Emirat Islami of Afghanistan. So what does this mean? When you talk with a number of Taliban leadership, they somehow take that this state means they take for granted the issue of Sharia-based state. And a Sharia-based state is a state which upholds religion. Number one responsibility of a theological state would be to safeguard and preserve religion and the faith. When I can, if I reflect back to history, the good example that I can give from the Muslim Islamist parties could be the case of 2002 when MMA, Mutahida Majlis Amal, a coalition of 6 Islamist parties, won election in the northwestern province of Pakistan with the support of Pervez Musharraf. As soon as these parties came into power, what they did was the primary goal of this party was to uphold religion and use the state to safeguard religion. That's why the regional assembly ratified a law which is called Hasbala. And based on Hasbala, the state is authorized and has the right to do moral policing and religious policing, the same practice that Taliban did in 1996 in Afghanistan. So I think when the Taliban come back to power, and they are talking about an Islamic state, for them a state is not an agency to protect the freedom or rights of individual. Rather, the primary goal of that kind of state will be a theological state. Second proposition is that Taliban has leaned much more in recent years towards takfiri movements. And what do I mean by takfiri movement is that it's more somehow similar as Salafi movements, that they consider whoever is not loyal, not only to their religious understanding, but even to their political claims. They will label these people as apostates. For example, when you talk with the rank and file of Taliban, much of the literature on this rebel studies claim the fact that rank and file is much more radical compared to the political leadership. And rank and file of Taliban heavily believes that they cannot cooperate with the national security forces of Afghanistan because they are apostates. And why they are apostates? Because they were fighting against the Taliban and the claim of Taliban. That's why you can see a large movement of takfirism among the Taliban. The last claim is that Taliban deeply believe in somehow clash of civilization. For Taliban, all these modern values, like human rights, equality of gender, and political pluralism. These are the values that are imposed by the Western countries, and particularly the US, and they are not indigenous to the country. You can see a kind of strategic alliance between Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which has the same goal, the war against the West. For example, most recently in June 2016, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Taliban, has sworn a bay'ah to the newly appointed leader of Taliban, who was Haibatullah Akhundzada, the predecessor of Akhtar Mansour. Similarly, if you see a segment of online Taliban have been calling for targeting journalists, intellectuals, human rights, and civil society activists, who they see to be a part of ideological invasion of the West. So it doesn't matter whether even you can be a national of Afghanistan, but because you are a part of ideological invasion of the West, that's why you should be targeted by the Taliban. So again, today, in the current context, unlike 90s, the Taliban emerged back to, I will wrap up, to build back the Hobbesian breakdown of state and morality, but at the current juncture, their goal is much more radical because they are aligned to global radical terrorist groups. So that's why a military victory of Taliban in Afghanistan, if it occur, would be viewed by much of these Salafi Jihadi groups as a major triumph against the United States. Much it was seen like the withdrawal of the Soviets from Afghanistan in 1989 as a source of inspiration for much of the radical groups like Al-Qaeda. And briefly, because the time is short, if I flag some of the reasons that why Taliban has become more radicalized in the last couple of years compared to 90s, we can claim, for example, the first reason could be war in Iraq in 2003, because in war in Iraq in 2003, you can see a massive use of suicide attacks by the Muslim insurgents. And this has given inspiration to those weakened insurgent groups in the region, for example, the Taliban, that they have cautiously used suicide attack as a weapon of the weak as an instrument against a superpower. Similarly, because much of the political leadership of Taliban, unlike 90s, they migrated to Pakistan, and some of them migrated to Gulf countries. So they were exposed to the outside world. They came into contact with the ideologues of Muslim Brotherhood. You see that during 90s, the Taliban banned most of the Muslim Brotherhood books in Afghanistan. But when they got exposure to the Arab Gulf countries, they read their books, and now they are much more comfortable with Muslim Brotherhood, for example, figures like Al-Qarzawi, and even the Salafi figures in the region. And finally, also, we cannot ignore the role of media, because in 90s, much of Afghanistan was not connected with, there wasn't any social media, there wasn't television for the rural Afghanistan, so these students emerged knowing nothing about other side of the world. But now media has given them leverage and privilege to learn from the similar organizations in other regions and implement those techniques and methods. Thank you so much.